What's up, my wizards? It's Dev from SBMTG on the YouTube.com. Down there, we like magic, you know by now. And today I'm bringing you a deck I've wanted to bring you for a while. This is Sultai Delirium. This is a deck that's been getting a lot of press lately, actually, in the last couple of months, since the beginning of the year or so. I've seen articles about this deck on Channel Fireball, on Star City Games. I've seen a daily MTG update that featured this deck. I've seen a write-up on it on MTGGoldfish.com, and there's a lot of Redditors trying to make this deck work too. So the internet is really trying to figure out what the best build for this deck is. So today, I'm going to sort of bring you the most updated build for it. But before we do that, I don't do this very often, but I felt like it was prudent for this one. I'm going to go through a quick history of Sultai Delirium. Well, Sultai Delirium has its genesis all the way back in Shadows over Innistrad, when people were like, hey, let's just use Traverse the Ulvenwald to search up Ishkanah, and then combine that with black removal and blue counterspells. And the deck was a little bit clunky and didn't have all of its pieces back then, and even when Eldritch Moon came out and it got Liliana, which is a key piece nowadays, and Emrakul, which it can no longer play, the deck was still sort of just assaulted by the deluge of Bant Company decks, and even Green-White Tokens decks are not a great matchup for this thing. And then Kalitas came out, and the deck got Torrential Gearhulk, which was actually something that changed the design of the deck completely. You know, people were like, we can still get Delirium, but now we have to play a bunch more instants to make Torrential Gearhulk work. With Kalitas, there was a lot of aggro in the format. Vehicles was a huge deck, and, you know, we just kind of lost. We kind of lost to those. But updated now with Aether Revolt, we get a couple of pieces in that set that are really good against aggro, specifically Fatal Push, and also Walking Ballista. So now that you sort of know, and that was a very, very quick addended version of the history of the deck, but now that you sort of know what all evolution the deck has been through, let me bring you up to speed and tell you what the deck looks like nowadays. Well, the best way to describe this deck is basically a control deck mixed with a mid-range deck, you know? We're going to play counter spells and black removal and stuff like that on the control side, but we're going to add green so that we get some really nice fat threats to throw out onto the board and sort of play however we need to play, proactively or reactively given the situation. Which is good because it allows a couple of different decks to come together to attack decks that they're not normally good against, you know. For instance, Green-Black Delirium is not great against the control matchup. Well, if we add a couple of counter spells in the main deck and maybe a couple more in the side, then we can do a lot better against the Jeskai Saheeli decks. Another deck, Blue-Black Control, was a preseason all-star. Everybody had high hopes for that deck, but in this format, with a bunch of great threats, Blue-Black Control just couldn't keep up. You know, it didn't have all the removal that it needed, and it didn't have the good threats to put on board to close a game out. So, with that in mind, we'll just sort of combine those two decks to shore up their worst matchups. Now, one last thing I want to note about this deck before I get to the individual card choices is that it's a very turtley deck. This is probably the grindiest deck in the format right now. You know, the early to mid-game turns are all going to be used trying to shut your opponent out of keeping anything viable on board, and then we're going to try to turn the corner on turn 6 and sometimes way later. And this deck can go very, very late into the game. Just getting into turn 12, 13 is great for this deck, and the later the game goes, the better chance you have of grinding one out. So with that in mind, now that you got sort of all the workings of the deck down, let me show you what cards are actually in it. Well, it all starts with the 2 of Liliana, the Last Hope, which I told you earlier is a critical piece in the deck. Definitely. First of all, Liliana can pick off small creatures with your first ability, but mostly the important ability in this deck is her second one that allows us to bring creatures back from the graveyard, put them in our hand. That is really, really important to get extra mileage out of Torrential Gearhulks, Noxious Gearhulks, Walking Ballistas, and literally every creature that we're playing. It's just insane to put back into your hand with a Liliana to grind out long games. You know, early we can play a Walking Ballista, basically sacrifice or remove all the counters to kill a small guy. Then later in the game, bring back that same Walking Ballista and play it as a 4/4 or something. Same thing with Torrential Gearhulk. You know, Torrential Gearhulk already gives us a crazy amount of value when it enters the battlefield, but if they manage to kill it, then we can get it back with Liliana. And at that point, our opponent knows we're holding a Torrential Gearhulk and knows what's in our graveyard. So it just sort of becomes a thing where okay, if I cast any spell, they get to counter it and get a 5/6. That's awful for them. So being able to bring back some of these creatures with a Liliana is probably the most important thing that the deck does. But it can also just ultimately Liliana and then win the game as long as it can stay around for a few turns. And you might be thinking, if Liliana is so important, why only play 2 copies of her? Well, first of all, we're going to play a 3rd copy in the sideboard, so there's that. But another thing to remember is that this deck is, again, very, very slow, this plays turtly, so we're not really looking to stick a turn 3 Liliana and be completely tapped out to whatever the opposing deck wants to do to us. We don't want to do that. We mostly want to play our Liliana on like turn 6 through 10 or 12. You know, a late game Liliana is one of the best things we can do. We have a very long time to find a Liliana and her be very relevant. So, you know, you've got till turn 6 or 7 to find the stupid thing. You don't have to play a bunch of copies of it. Last note about Liliana is that she obviously helps fuel our Delirium too. So, you know, this deck does not get Delirium very fast. You probably won't get Delirium until the, you know, mid to late game, turn 6, turn 7 sometimes, and even later on occasion. The deck is not like some of the Delirium decks that just try to get Delirium as fast as possible. So, you know, don't feel like you're super pressured to get it. Liliana will help you get there in the late game. Well, let's take a look at all these creatures that we can get back with Liliana, because they're really what sets the deck apart from a lot of the control decks in the format. A lot of control decks don't get to play this sort of high density of threats. So we'll start with the 3-up Torrential Gearhulk, because it's one of the most important things that we're doing, and it influences the deck's design. Now, it can sound a little bit awkward to both have to play a bunch of instants to make sure Torrential Gearhulk works well, and also get Delirium, but again, we're turtling to Delirium, and we're not going to get it until late game, and we've accepted that basic fact. You know, once we do turn on Delirium, a few of our cards get much, much better, but we can sweat it. We can wait till the late game and get Delirium, so not that worried about it. We can, you know, design some of the deck around this card. And, you know, whether we're recasting a counter spell or a Glimmer of Genius or a removal spell, Torrential Gearhulk's always going to be good, and it's always going to put a 5-6 guy on the board that can win the game in 4 turns. It's one of the best things to get back with a Liliana, because it just puts your opponent, again, in this, like, super hopeless situation. Like, oh, if I play a creature, he'll blow it away. If I play a spell, he'll counter it, you know? And get a huge guy I can't deal with. Like, it's a 2-for-1, basically. So, like, Torrential Gearhulk is just insane, whether you're casting it for the first time or whether you're getting it back with a Liliana. Next in a line of great creatures to just get back anytime you want to is Walking Ballista, which we're going to play a 3 of in the deck here. Ballista's just getting more and more of a presence in this format. You know, Mardu Vehicles has decided to sort of shift its focus and not play Veteran Motorist and instead play Walking Ballista so that it has some late game options. This deck is also playing Walking Ballista so it can have some late game options. You know, sometimes we'll play this on turn 2 or turn 4 even and blow away a small guy that they've played and then get it back later with a Liliana and make it truly, truly scary. That's really, really good. We can blow away small dudes and still do damage to the opponent too. This is both an artifact and a creature in the graveyard for Delirium, so there's that reason to play it. There's also a play that I keep running into where, like, they play a Walking Ballista turn 2, you go and play a Walking Ballista, target their Walking Ballista with yours, they respond by shooting you with a Walking Ballista, and both of your ballistas die. That's happened a good bit. It's mostly like Walking Ballista can also be a sorcery speed spell that you pay 2 of any mana for and you pay a life and destroy target Walking Ballista. It happens a lot. The sort of battle of ballistas at the beginning of the game. So there's also that little piece of tech to remember too. But mostly this can be brought back in the late game to great effect and is one of the best top decks in the entire format for that matter. We're also going to play 3 Tireless Trackers in the deck. This is good for all kinds of reasons. It's just become huge over the course of the late game. Like, if there's a grindy card in the format, this is the poster child. This is the face of grind right now in this format, because it just becomes huge over the course of the game. It gives us a way to draw cards, which is really important. You know, we want to play threats in this deck, but we're a control deck. We still want to draw cards. Well, Tireless Tracker solves that puzzle. He makes late game, you know, land draws into something really, really important. He's really good with Fatal Push. You know, he gives us something that we can just for 2 mana sack, draw a card, and activate the Revolt on Fatal Push. So there's a bunch of reasons to play Tireless Tracker in this deck, obviously. We're going to play 1 Noxious Gearhulk in the deck, mostly because, you know, it works really well with Liliana. That's another thing that puts him in a hopeless situation, you know. Oh, I know they just got back a Noxious Gearhulk. If you play a creature, he'll blow it away and have a huge guy. So there's another, you know, just situation of desperation that we can put our opponent into and just get a huge guy off of it that's tough to block. Like, what's not to like about Noxious? We'll make room for the 1 copy. And to finish off the creatures, one of the whole reasons to play a Delirium theme in the deck, 2 copies of Ishkanah Grafwidow, who is really, really good against the Mardu Vehicles decks. This is good against Heart of Kiran, obviously. Blocks that really well. You can either block it and survive, and, you know, nothing happens. So there's that. Or you can block it with the Ishkanah and one of its tokens and end up killing the Heart of Kiran. So there's that too. This is just also good for like blocking a bunch of creatures on the ground or in the air, you know. Really good for clogging up the board against aggro and getting an instant board presence against control decks. You know, this puts a bunch of power on the board if you can resolve it against control. So Ishkanah is just good against a lot of the stuff in the format, you know, even against the green-black counters deck. This again puts a bunch of stuff on the ground to just like soak things up and block for a turn or two. So Ishkanah is just good in almost every situation once you have Delirium, so we'll play it. And by the way, you can also grind out, which again we're looking to do in this deck. You can grind out wins by just using that other ability on her and slowly killing your opponent turn after turn. The bulk of the deck really though is all the spells. We're playing 21 spells in the deck, and a lot of them are instants so that we can make sure that Torrential Gearhulk is live as often as possible. But before I go through the removal and the counter spells and stuff, I'm going to go with the most interesting choice in the deck first, and that's the 2 of Grapple with the Past. One of the most written about tricks in the deck is Grapple with the Past plus Torrential Gearhulk. You know, you play your Grapple, get back a Torrential Gearhulk, play the Gearhulk, and play the Grapple again. You get another creature, you know. You can get back a second Torrential Gearhulk, so that's really cool too. Grapple's nice, and it gives us some parity with Liliana. Another way to bring back any of these creatures that are really, really insane in the late game. So Grapple's just good for all kinds of reasons. Fills the graveyard for Delirium, fills the graveyard for Torrential Gearhulk, you know, put some instants in there too. So just for 2 mana, this is insane card advantage that can quote-unquote draw us a creature in the late game and do graveyard stuff for us. So absolutely worth a slot. While we're on the subject of sort of card advantage here, I might as well tell you about the real card advantage in the deck, the 3 of Glimmer of Genius here. Glimmer of Genius is the real card advantage here, and we are a pseudo-control deck, so we want to play a few different pieces in the late game that we can, you know, refill our hand with. So Glimmer of Genius is one of the best ways of doing that, and even though we don't have a whole bunch of energy synergy in the deck, this is still something amazing that allows us to see a bunch of cards at instant speed, refill our hand, insane to recast with a Torrential Gearhulk, you know, just great card, and we don't have room for all 4, but we definitely do still have room for 3, even despite the fact that we don't have a whole lot of synergy for the energy it produces. It's just still a great card. Key piece here, we're going to play 4 Traverse the Ulvenwald in the deck. Now, just 1 mana is a steal. That's an insane rate for all the stuff this thing can do for us, and the ways it allows us to build the deck in the first place. You know, this allows us to employ a little bit more of a toolbox strategy and not play as many copies of certain creatures. You know, we're comfortable with the 3 of Torrential Gearhulk. We're comfortable with the 2 of Ishkanah. That's totally fine because we've got Traverse the Ulvenwald to help find those pieces when we need them. In the early game, this can help fix our mana and allows us to like play a few less lands than we normally would. A deck like this would want to play 26, 27 lands, but we get away with 25 because we're probably going to be casting at least 1 Traverse the Ulvenwald in the early game. And in the late game, Traverse the Ulvenwald can go and get any creature that we need, which is often lights out because we've got a bunch of creatures that are good in a lot of different situations. Add in the fact that the converted mana cost, just 1 mana, usually allows you to go ahead and cast the creature that you tutored for that same turn. So drawing a Traverse and turning it into an Ishkanah or turning it into a Torrential Gearhulk is just freaking nuts. Like, casting a Traverse the Ulvenwald late game and still having a bunch of mana to get that Walking Ballista on the board huge is very, very nice. Now let's move on to all the removal that we're playing in the deck because it is key to the deck's success. You know, we were very bad in the aggro matchup, so we want to shore that up as much as we can game 1. Let's take a look here. We're going to play 4 copies of Fatal Push, 2 copies of Grasp of Darkness, 1 copy of Murder, and 2 copies of To the Slaughter here. That's 9 total removal pieces, not counting Walking Ballista, Noxious Gearhulk. Torrential Gearhulk can recast any of these things, getting extra mileage out of them. Liliana can pop creatures too, so there's a lot of removal in this deck. But the best piece, as far as, you know, this deck being viable finally, is Fatal Push. Fatal Push really, really helps us out in that aggro matchup, which before was just an automatic scoop in game 1. But since we can push all 4 copies of Fatal Push here, then that really, really helps that matchup out. It's also decent in the mid-range matchup against green-black counters because it can kill snakes just naturally. It can kill Gifted Aetherborns naturally, Sylvan Advocates the same way, but it's not too hard to activate Revolt in between Tireless Tracker and Evolving Wilds in this deck. So it's not too hard to also blow away like Rishkars and stuff that's way bigger, you know. And, by the way, this also takes out Heart of Kiram, which is good against a lot of different decks in the format, but especially Mardu Vehicles, which is probably our worst matchup. So Fatal Push is easily the best piece of removal in the deck, and we have to play all 4. That said, Grasp of Darkness is still great. and can break up Cat combo, as can a Revolted Fatal Push, by the way. Keep that in mind. But the fact that it breaks up Cat combo makes Grasp of Darkness pretty much a must-play, but we don't want to play all the copies, because having to have 2 black mana that early is not something that we always want to have to do. So there's that. Murder is better than it looks. Murder can just take out any creature at instant speed, which is insanely relevant against not only Cat combo, but also green-black counters, because their creatures get huge, and a lot of other removal won't be able to touch them. So, you know, something that can just unconditionally remove a creature is very, very important. And as far as To the Slaughter goes, To the Slaughter is being played in a bunch of decks that don't even really get Delirium ever. So just the fact that we can get Delirium on it makes it that much better in this deck, but it's just so good against Planeswalkers right now at instant speed too, which is key to the card. And it's got an advantage over Ruinous Path, not just the instant speed, but the fact that it's just 1 black mana to cast, which is super important too. To the Slaughter is a very important card right now, and this deck casts it better than a lot of other decks do. To finish off the main deck, let's play a few counter spells. Now, we don't want to go overboard on the counter spells in the main deck, because the counter spells mostly shore up our game against green-black counters, which we already have decent game against, and other control decks, which we also already have decent game against. So we're going to devote a lot of slots in the main board to taking out aggro, but don't worry, we've got more slots for counters in the board. So let's just take a look at what we're playing in the main here. We're going to play 2 copies of Disallow and 1 copy of Negate. Now, the reason we don't want to play a whole bunch of these 3-mana counter spells is that they all require 2 blue mana. And sure, we're playing Torrential Gearhulk at 3 of, that's also 2 blue, but we have until at least turn 6, and sometimes even later, to find that 2 blue mana. So, you know, Torrential Gearhulk is a lot easier to cast than Disallow, because Disallow will often want to cast on turn 3, especially if we're on the play. So Disallow is a little harder to cast. We don't want to play 3 or 4 copies of it, or Void Shatter for that matter. But we do still want to carry counter spells so that we can have good game against the decks that want to go a little bit longer. And Negate is always better than it looks in this format, because it counters vehicles, counters planeswalkers, counters artifacts, counters a bunch of different stuff people are trying to play, and Heart of Kiran, which is basically a creature. So Negate is at its best right now, and it's worth the 1 main deck copy. Now, we're going to play 25 lands in this deck, and note that we're not playing Aether Hub. I'll probably get this question in the comments. Now, Aether Hub looks like it would be great with Glimmer of Genius, but fact of the matter is we're not comfortable playing Glimmer until the late game a lot of the time. You know, sometimes you'll play it at the end of your opponent's turn on turn 4. That's the earliest we can play it. Now, this deck really, really, really has to get through the early turns in order to be viable. And in those early turns, we're trying to get double blue for Disallow. We're trying to get double black for Grasp of Darkness, double black for Liliana. So we can't afford to only be able to tap our Aether Hub once for colored mana in turns, 1 through 4. We don't have that luxury, so we can't quite afford to play Aether Hub. Now, we do get the excellent Evolving Wilds, which is great with Tireless Tracker, and it's great with Delirium. So both of those things are important, and obviously it helps fix our mana and thin our deck too. So got to play all 4 copies of Evolving Wilds. And the last thing I want to point out here is that Lumbering Falls is actually really, really good right now. You know, people are focusing on Fatal Push, on License Disintegration, Grasp of Darkness, Harness Lightning, Shock, all that stuff. Lumbering Falls doesn't get hit by any of it at all. And usually man lands are weak to Fatal Push, like really, really weak to Fatal Push, but Lumbering Falls just doesn't care at all. So Hexproof is very good right now, and to have it on what is essentially a free creature is insane. Now here's our sideboard here, and this is different than a lot of lists. Now, the list that I've just shown you as far as the main board and the lands is a very typical list for the current incarnation of this deck, but the sideboard is very different. Now, I am playing some one-ofs, but the sideboard is usually a mess of one-ofs, and I've cleaned it up a little bit here, and here's my reasoning. We're going to play Natural Obsolescence instead of the usual mess of obsolescences and natural states. Obsolescence is just very good against Heart of Kiran, obviously, but insanely good against Scrap Heap Scrounger, which is a card we worry very, very much about. That is also the reasoning behind the 3 of Flaying Tendrils, and also the 1 of Expertise, but most of the Flaying Tendrils, because Flaying Tendrils also takes out Scrap Heap Scrounger, where we never have to worry about it ever again. And it's very effective against all the vehicles decks in the format because they play a lot of 1 and 2 toughness creatures. Yahenni's expertise can take out things that are just a peg above that and also cast other removal spells and stuff for us. Or we can get a grapple with the past off of it or something. Sometimes we'll even cast a Traverse the Ulvenwald off of it, kill a bunch of their guys, go get a dude of our own. So that's important too. Transgress the Mind shores up our matchup against Control and Jeskai Saheeli, which we already have a pretty decent matchup, but pretty much any of these anti-control cards like Transgress the Mind and Negate that are in here, To the Slaughter, they're all exclusively against the Saheeli combo, so keep that in mind. Liliana helps us grind out games that we think we're going to go long, like green-black counters is a good example. Horribly Awry is in there against aggro, but you can also side it in sometimes, if you want to, against Saheeli. I'll leave that up to you because it also counters Felidar Guardian, which is important. And then Kalitas is a card that you don't often see in these sideboards, which I do not understand. Kalitas is very, very good against aggro, and aggro is our absolute worst matchup, so I want to carry one copy of him somewhere in the 75. And here are your power rankings right here. Final score of 65, which seems a little bit lower than some of the decks in the format. You know, I've scored Mardu Vehicles at like a 68, I think it was. I've scored Jund Energy Aggro to 67. So, but again, I've said this before, don't put too much stock in these power rankings, especially with control decks, because they usually suffer in certain categories, and this one's no different. Although, this one does have more offense than your typical control deck, for sure, obviously, while still keeping a bunch of defense and some counterspells main deck too. So there's a lot of ways the deck can play. It's got a bunch of versatility, but be warned, it's a fairly high difficulty in playing this deck, and it's got a very high learning curve, you know, concerning what plays you're supposed to make against what decks, at what, on what turns and in what situations. Incredibly high learning curve. You have to teach yourself when you can and cannot tap out against certain decks, when you can afford to play a creature, and when you have to leave up mana for removal or a counter. Very high difficulty here, but if you are a disciplined player who is patient, that is an important thing to remember, because again, the deck is very, very long game focused and turtly. If you're a patient player, this deck will reward you. It's got sort of a great, good, poor sort of paper, rock, scissors matchup right now, you know. Against Control, the deck tends to be very, very good because it's got a lot of instant speed answers in the form of removal and counter spells for the Saheeli combo, and it's got big threats of its own that deck has to answer. So it's pretty good in that matchup, and I'd put that matchup at like 65-35, you know. But against the green-black counters matchup, we're looking a little bit more like 50-50. It's all dependent on who gets their big threats out first. Now, if you can grind them out, kill their guys, don't let them go too wide, don't let them do too much damage too early, don't let them get perfect play lines like Snake into Rishkar and Verdurus, you're in trouble if they do that. Don't let them get those kind of play lines, and you can grind the game out, but they're really dangerous early, so I'm calling that matchup 50-50. Now, against aggro, like Mardu Vehicles, and even Mardu Ballista, to some extent, the deck does suffer, and I feel like that's only like a 35 or 40% matchup for us game 1, but the game gets much more winnable in game 2 and 3. Now, the only bad thing about the deck, really, unless you just really don't like turtly decks, don't play this deck if you don't. But the really bad thing about the deck is the price tag. This version right here is about $375 on TCG Player, which stacks up with all the big decks in the format right now. You know, Mardu Vehicles, Green-Black Counters, Jeskai Saheeli. They'll all cost you around $400 to build, and this deck is no different, but it can hang with the big boys, especially once you get some games in with it. This really takes some time to learn the ins and outs of, but once you get rocking and rolling, you'll understand sort of what you're supposed to do against other decks. And again, I hope I've outlined that fairly well here, but this is one of those decks that you have to play to get comfortable with. Tapped out for now. That's all I got to say on this one, but I got some more stuff to say. First of all, we have hit officially 50,000 subscribers now. Thank you all for that. That's awesome. We're at 50,000 subscribers, and I'm still planning a special for that. I may do a skit, still boiling that one over, but also, 50K Q&A coming up. I've already got a bunch of questions in my inbox from you guys, but you still got a couple of days before I put that video out. So here's my email address. Send any questions you have for me to that right there, and I'll get them answered for you during the Q&A. Can't wait. I love doing Q&A, so can't wait to do that for you guys. I've already gotten a bunch of great questions. Here's a question, though. What are we doing next time? That's also really important. Next time is the Black-Red Aggro deck for very, very cheap. Just looking to build this deck for $40, $45, something like that. The cheapest black-red aggro in the format, and still super duper effective. So be on the lookout for that. It's coming real soon. 50,000. I'm super jacked about that. You guys have no idea. I'm barely keeping it together. We have made it to 50,000 subs, and like Wedge stopped by the comments the other day. My buddy the Professor stopped by the comments just to congratulate me. That meant a lot to me. Both of you guys, if you're still here watching this, that's awesome. Meant a lot to me, and just anyone that commented like congratulations on 50K. That meant a lot to me too. A lot of you have been with me for a very long time, and I hope you're here with me for a while to go. So I will see you guys next time with more deck techs and a Q&A very soon. I'm Deb from SBMTG. Thanks for watching, my wizards.